In this video, I go cross-eyed looking at all the various performance settings and visual effects settings in AMS2 in an effort to get the best performance balance for jitter-free racing and hopefully some great-looking graphics using the 4070 Super and the Quest 3. And as always, all this from an older gamer's perspective. In a recent video, I looked at the best possible settings for iRacing using a 4070 Super with a VR headset, the Quest 3 set to 90Hz. Here I am going to attempt the same with AMS2, and I say attempt because out of the box with all the visual FX set to off and all the performance settings set to absolute minimum in AMS2, or in some cases turned completely off, I still have just a 30% headroom using the 4070 Super. This 30% I'm going to call from now on the base setting. Everything is off, and this is what my system can manage at the very bottom of the graphical ladder for AMS2 in VR. So this is what I call the base setting. Remember that. It's important. 30% is of course not a lot to play with if I want to increase some of the other settings. In comparison to iRacing, with everything turned off, I can still get a headroom that's around 50% in that sim. So I have my work cut out with AMS2 in order to turn up the base settings and reach graphical nirvana without tanking the performance headroom. But I'm going to give it a go anyway.
You crazy fool!
Settings that hit performance headroom the hardest. Bear in mind that I'm talking right now about AMS2 with VR, specifically with the Quest 3 using the 4070 Super and a 13600K Intel chip. If you are using AMS2 with a different system or outputting to a monitor, you may not see the same performance headroom that I am seeing. With that said, the biggest hit to performance headroom in AMS2 appears to unsurprisingly be MSAA when set to high, which tanks my system to -4 from the base setting of 30%. Remember, this is with everything else turned off. MSAA set to medium also isn't that wonderful, bringing performance headroom down from 30% to just 12%. Low, however, was not too bad, coming in at around 17% from the base reading of 30%. MSAA does help out with the visual quality of sim racing, specifically by removing jagged edges from various lines. It is good to have it on, but in this case, I couldn't justify moving it beyond low as a balance between graphical fidelity and performance. Track detail was another big performance hit, but only when set to ultra. At this setting, AMS2 drops from the base setting of 30% to 19%. However, if I back that off to medium, I could get it to 20%. The difference between medium and high were not that extreme, so in the end, I end up leaving it set to high. Shadows is of course another unsurprising entry into the category of settings you should avoid. At Ultra, it took the base settings down to 7%, and even low was not much better, dropping the base setting to 15%. I would advise leaving shadows off, especially as even when shadows are set to off, each car does have a base shadow underneath it, which at least grounds the car in reality. But the extra shadows, when you turn shadows on from walls and fence posts, are not really worth the extra performance hit in AMS2. In iRacing, I do love them, but here they have less appeal to me, partly because on some tracks there is a lot of flickering in these shadows, which I find distracting. Moving on to those settings that could be filed under a lesser evil is anisotropic filtering, which did impact performance, but only when I pushed it to 16x. Leaving it at 8x was about the sweet spot, as there seems to be little difference, performance headroom-wise, between 8x and 4x. Environment maps are also something that's not a heavy performance drain, but also not really a must-have in terms of the graphics looking pretty. Environment maps are responsible for the strength of reflective surfaces as seen here, and it does hit performance hard if set to high. Dropping this to low is probably the sensible option, considering that you still get some benefit from this setting at low without the massive performance headroom drain that high gives you. Enhanced mirror also has a big impact on the performance headroom for minimal graphical improvement, with perhaps some slight increase when looking in the mirrors as seen here, but it is so slight I would leave this setting off. It's really not worth it. The option to have a pit crew is a weird one. Even if you decide to only display your own pit crew and no one else's, it still has a bit of a hit to performance, but only when you come into the pits. It didn't seem to affect performance at all, even when driving past the pits on the home stretch. But as the pit crew are composed of 4 clones, which look very creepy, you would probably be best to leave this setting off. You just don't need it. You really don't. It adds nothing to the sim and takes away valuable resources that you could use elsewhere. Likewise, grass set to high was a big performance hit, but why would you need grass at a high level? Why? I have no idea. Unless you really need that level of immersion, leave this one off. So, if these are all the bad agents when it comes to tanking performance headroom, what exactly can you turn up to higher setting? And what does the best performance to graphical fidelity actually look like? Let's find out.
Very exciting.
Best settings to balance performance with graphics in VR at 90 Hz. After a lot of messing about and many reboots of the game, I settled on this particular list of settings. Remember, this is for VR when using the 4070 Super with the Quest 3 at 90 Hz. So from the top to bottom, you can see I have resolution at the top, which is just taking a mirror image that appears on the PC monitor. So this is set to 1280 by 720 to reduce the performance impact. Below that is texture resolution, which I have set to high. This does have an impact on performance, but it can help to make things look crisp and detailed. So I think it's worth pushing this one to high if you can, but if you are struggling, it's a good one to back off to medium. Anisotropic is at 8x. VSync, I don't need a VR, so that's off. MSAA is the big performance hit, as we saw earlier, so that's at low. Reflections and environment maps at low. Car detail is set to high, which does drop the base performance from 30% to 19%. However, I do like my cars to look good, so I left this on high, and the performance headroom be damned.
Well, that seems a little foolhardy, doesn't it, Peter?
Max visible cars are set to 12, which can cause some weird pop-ins for larger races, so you may need to adjust this to suit. But obviously, the more cars that are visible, the larger the impact on performance. Track detail is also set to high, as I do spend a lot of time looking at the track, and I like this to look as clear as possible, even with the performance hit when it's set to high, which at least wasn't as bad when I set it to ultra. Pit crew is just weird, so I left that off, and shadows are off for the reasons detailed earlier. Likewise, enhanced mirror, which is set to no, and detailed grass is off because you really don't need it unless you are a landscape gardener. Motion blur I also left off as I'm not a fan. Lastly, there is particles, with 2 settings here controlling the level and density of smoke and other debris that occur during a race. Whilst these have a strong impact on the performance headroom, I find the race is a little flat with no smoke at all, especially when in a Formula V race, so I set both to medium and live with the performance hit. In this case, it's less about graphics and more about immersion, especially when in VR. And that's it. Here you see Hockenheim Ring in the Formula V racing under partly clouded weather. I'll come back to weather later in this video, with just 12 cars on track. As you can see, although the performance headroom is right down the bottom, sometimes wandering into negative territory, the amount of drop frames is minimal. Don't take any notice of the application frames dropped readout. Those drop frames were accumulated while AMS2 was loading. Look instead here, which is showing the actual frame rate during the race. As you can see, there are occasional dips from 90 FPS to 89 FPS, but this is very normal in VR and about what I would expect. It's also very usable in an actual race.
Left. You're clear.
Best visual effects settings for VR. With the Performance tab set to the best possible performance to graphical quality balance for my system while using the 4070 Super with the Quest 3, I turned my attention to the Visual FX tab to see what I could turn up. Here I found that on balance, setting this tab to something I found visually appealing was trial and error. All of these settings are very subjective to each user, and I would encourage you all to just play around with this tab until you find something that you like. This is what I like, and it didn't seem to hit performance too much, as you can see here in this example. There were some frame drops per lap, going down to 89 FPS, again maybe once or twice per lap, but it wasn't excessive. It wasn't something that would disturb my race. It was very usable, very raceable. In all, the Visual FX tab at these settings didn't really impact my race at all. Perhaps if they went higher or I was under different weather conditions, this might change. But in these conditions, under these circumstances, they were just fine.
Fair enough.
With 20 cars on the same track, with visible cars set to 20, I saw a slight dip in performance, but still had a sim that maintained a steady 90 frames per second, with just the occasional frame drop every lap. Granted, there is not a lot of performance left on the table, but for good weather racing and a packed field of Formula Vs in VR, this is not too shabby. Of course, opening up the conversational door to weather is a bit of a can of worms for AMS 2, and it's best to note that extreme bad weather can have a devastating effect on the performance of this sim. Light weather, like clear skies, light fog, light rain, and even heavy fog with rain are all going to be conditions that do hit performance, but not to a greater extent. However, add a thunderstorm to the mix and it's a different story, with ASW rearing its ugly head, despite the fact that I have this turned off in the Oculus debug tool. So much for that setting. So these graphical settings that I've set up have their limitations, and it's worth remembering that when you enter a race, particularly a multiplayer one. It's just a shame that AMS2 doesn't support customized user presets like ACC does, as this would take a lot of the guesswork and time out of setting up the sim for every race condition.
I'd buy that for $1.
I have focused mostly on the GPU in this video, the 4070 Super, but just in case you are curious as to how much CPU is being used during a single race, I set up a GoPro camera in front of my monitor and videoed a simple CPU usage gadget positioned on the desktop next to the AMS2 mirror. The CPU gadget is a minimal app, and it's to reduce any impact it might have on performance, and I'm videoing the screen with a GoPro for the same reason. Here you can see a race starting up and the CPU usage climbing in the gadget, but it never goes that high, sometimes 65%, but still, the CPU is comfortably coping with whatever AMS2 has to throw at it. It never really breaks a sweat, not even once. Conclusion. In conclusion, getting to the final settings shown here with the Visual FX optimal settings as shown here was a process that was both unsurprising and uplifting. I mean, it kinda all went as I expected it to go. Shadows are bad, MSAA is evil when set to high, and high-level grass is a total waste of your GPU's time. And really the only surprise was how weird the pit crew were. But once I had identified all the usual suspects and tuned the settings to only focus on visual improvements, I had a pretty good looking version of AMS2 that didn't suck the life out of my system. And I found it interesting to see that the CPU is only ever using around 65% of its power at most. At the end of the day though, it has to be said, if you are having issues with performance using VR, then the easiest and most reliable solution is to turn down the refresh rate to 72 Hz. On my system, with the 4070 Super and the 13600K, I can race with a decent array of visual settings at a fairly aggressive level, as you can see here, at 90 Hz. But if I switch to 72 Hz, I have an even greater performance headroom. Just for the record, here is 72 Hz on the left, 90 Hz in the middle, and finally 120 Hz on the right, with performance best possible averages looking something like this for each individual refresh rate. As I mentioned in earlier videos, 72 Hz to 90 Hz doesn't really bother me that much. And although 120 Hz does look very smooth, I'm not sure it makes that much of a difference to my daily racing to justify the huge hit to performance it takes. However, your system and your eyes may feel differently. In a future video, I will be doing this all over again, but with ACC. Until next time, race clean, and I will see you on track. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click the like button, and if you haven't already done so, subscribe. Click the little bell icon if you want to be notified of any future videos.